rarer. So on the next slide, I'm showing something that's called a genome browser at the top. This is how we sometimes look at genomes. And they are incredibly complex. It's like sort of taking a bit of code from your computer and then just looking at the raw code and trying to work out what it's doing. And it's really, really hard to do that. There are parts of the genome that encode proteins. They're the thing that we normally call genes, and the rest of the genome we call intergenic. And so what we're trying to do is find the places in the genome that encode resistance to the ash dieback fungus. And on the next slide, there's just a diagram that some of you may remember from school, showing what the protein coding part of DNA does. It's extremely clever how it works. So within the DNA, within the protein coding region, every 3 letters encodes an amino acid that is part of a protein. And there's a special adapter that connects those 3 letters to the amino acid. And this is how the cell can read off the code within the DNA and turn it into a chain of amino acids, and they form a peptide, and the peptide can fold up into very complex shapes. I'll show you some later. And those complex shapes form machines, and we run on those machines. That's how the software works. And people used to think that was the only bit of DNA that was important, the bit that did what's in this diagram. But the more we discover about DNA, the more we realize that all of the other bits are important too, and all doing different things. So over the years, we've understood more and more how complex the software is that we run on. On the next slide, I'm showing you another aspect of complexity that modern science has discovered, and we're zooming in here on the leaf of a tree. This is now at the microscopic level. You can see the different cells within the tree, and then inside the cells, this is a photosynthetic cell, and it's got photosynthetic membranes in things called the chloroplast. And then embedded in these membranes are these amazing little motors, and there are thousands and thousands of them just in a single cell. These motors are called ATP synthase. They run on a flow of hydrogen ions going across a cell. As they go across, they cause rotation to happen, and that rotation drives conformation changes at the top of this little machine. And actually the next slide has another image of it. And so you can see these incredibly complex shapes made of proteins that come together into a nano machine that is a motor that's processing energy, and it turns it turns a flow of hydrogen ions into chemical energy in the form of something called ATP. This motor takes in ADP and it throws out ATP, and that's how energy is moved around within our cells. This is really amazing nanotechnology. The other image is of something involved in the replication of DNA, and it kind of ratchets the DNA molecule through the middle, and as it does so, that enables it to be turned into 2 DNA molecules, each an exact copy of the other. The most amazing structures. And we've only known about these in the last 30 years. The person who first worked out the structure of ATP synthase, that motor there, won a Nobel Prize just for working out the structure of that machine. And there are other similar machines. So the next slide shows you another motor. This is called the bacterial flagellum. You have these swimming around in your gut. At the moment, bacteria are helping you digest food that you ate a few hours ago in your lower gut. And they're swimming around there, powered by these little motors. And again, incredible complexity. And on the next slide, you can see that very recently, it's been discovered that there's another little cog that intersects with the bigger part of the motor. And actually, we now know that the main drive is coming from that cog. That little bit is being driven by a flow of hydrogen ions. And you can see that it sometimes moves around, and when it does so, the direction of rotation changes. for the motor. People used to be really puzzled why it was that this motor could be going really fast in one direction and then suddenly go in the other direction. And it's because of this amazing cog mechanism. And on the next slide you can see a different view of that. There it is going one way, and then suddenly there's a conformation change, it flips around, and now it's rotating in the opposite direction, just as smoothly as that. You know, this is much better gearing than you probably have on your bike. You know, this is working like clockwork, but yet this is at the nano scale, and this is present in bacteria, of which there are trillions and trillions and trillions on the Earth. So modern science is revealing to us these amazing structures that people didn't know about before. And on the next slide, it's also helping us to understand better and better appreciate the complexity of things that we've known about for a long time. For example, the human mind. A few years ago, the EU gave a grant of 600 million euros to a large group of scientists to try to recreate the human mind on a computer. And then this article was written in the journal Nature when that project had finished, asking how the project had gone. And the answer basically was they couldn't do it. With all that money, all those bright people working together, they couldn't recreate the human brain on a computer. It's more complex than anything we can make, and maybe it even suggests to us our brain is more than just a computer. You know, maybe our brain has a component that is not even physical. And the more progress we make in artificial intelligence, I think the more we realize it's never going to be like us. It's good at some things, but there are some things that our brains can do that a computer will never be able to do. And it makes us appreciate anew just how amazing the human mind is. So presented with all that complexity, we have to ask ourselves, well, where does this come from? And this is the second part of my talk, which is on the next slide. Where did this come from? Presented with the findings of modern science, we just have to ask this question. And it's not just you and me that might ask this question. On the next slide, you'll see the title screen of a documentary that was aired by the BBC a few years ago called Universe. And this was presented by Brian Cox, who's on the next slide. And he says, everywhere you look on Earth, there is complexity, so you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge completely naturally in the universe? Where did this complexity come from? That is surely a massive question that all of us have to face. Well, let's think about the software of DNA. Whenever you and I have seen software being made, if we've ever seen it being made, it's been an intelligent person sitting down and very carefully writing a piece of code. And of course, often it's a whole team of intelligent people all writing code together. We need intelligences to make software. And the software that we have often breaks, it often fails, we need patches, we need updates because it's often imperfect. On the next slide, I've got a very, very simple piece of software. It's a signal that just says a common greeting made out of pebbles. If you saw that on a beach, you would immediately know an intelligence had been there. You wouldn't doubt for a moment that that had an intelligent cause. Somebody picked up the pebbles and spelt out hello. There are other shapes that pebbles might make that you would think, okay, the action of the waves would have made that shape. But when it's a shape like that fits something that we know has a function, that has a function of greeting us, we know an intelligence did that. Well, if something as simple as 5 letters spelt out with pebbles can signal to us an intelligence has been at work, well, how much more the 3.2 billion letters of the human genome, or the 880 million letters of the ash tree genome? It seems to me that there's a very obvious inference that we can make. There must have been an intelligent mind involved in this. And it's similar when we come to nanotechnology. The best nanotechnology that can be made in labs today is not half as sophisticated as the nanotechnology that we find in living cells, yet we know that really intelligent people have to work in large teams to produce the nanotechnology that we see. And again, when we encounter different shapes as we go about our daily lives, we're very good at inferring which of them could have come about purely by natural causes and which need an intelligence. So, for example, presented with these two stone arches, I think most of you wouldn't hesitate to say that the one at the top, although it looks very impressive, could have come about just through water eroding a rock. Yet the one below, even if you've never seen Stonehenge before, you would look at that and immediately say, somebody made that. An intelligent thought about that. I don't know how they made it. I don't know how they got those stones there, but I know that someone intelligent must have done that. I don't have to know how it got there to infer an intelligence did that. And it's like that when we look at the natural world. We see this software, we see this nanotechnology, and I think it's an obvious inference to make this must have been designed by an intelligence. Now this is a very, very ancient thing that has been pointed out. So for example, among the ancient Greeks, there were two philosophers, one called Democritus and one called Socrates. And Democritus said, well, everything looks very, very well designed, but maybe we've just won a kind of cosmic lottery. Maybe the universe is infinitely large and it's infinitely old, and different atoms are just constantly bumping up against each other. There's an infinite number of them. And then sometimes they come together to make complex shapes. And we just happen to be in that lucky place in this infinite universe at the lucky time when they happen to come together to make what we see around us in life. And Socrates was not at all persuaded by this. And he said, well, look, if we look at a statue, a stone statue, mimicking a human body, and in Greece at the time, this was the height of sophistication and artistry, to do a lifelike human statue. Socrates said, when you look at such a statue, you have to admire the creativity, the intelligence, the skill, the genius of the sculptor who made that statue. Well, said Socrates, how much more then, when you look at an actual human being, a real living, breathing human being, that the artist is merely copying in stone, how much more should you admire the artistry and the skill of the person who made that actual human being, and how obvious it is that somebody, some intelligence must have made it. Now let me give you an illustration of this. So as I said, at home we've got 4 kids, and something that features quite a lot in our lives at the moment is Brio train sets. And we have a very large quantity of Brio. I've only brought a very small subset of it here with me this evening. But imagine my wife and I had gone to bed one evening, all the Brio was packed away, and we knew it was all tidy. And we came down in the morning, and Brio was scattered across the floor. And the box containing the Brio had fallen over and made a real mess. But yet in the middle of that mess, there was this circle of Brio, perfect circle. I'm trying to just see if I can pick it up. Perfect circle of Brio, 8 pieces all together, and then Thomas the Tank Engine on top, there ready to go. Now imagine I said to my wife, oh wow, look at that. Just by chance, those 8 pieces have all just landed together into a circle. Thomas has landed on top. That's amazing, isn't it? We were lucky that happened. She would say, well, that's ridiculous. Somebody must have done this. One of the boys must have been up in the night when he wasn't meant to be and was playing with the Brio. Or maybe a thief broke into our house, got distracted by the Brio and built a train set and then left, having not stolen anything. And if I sort of persisted with my point and said, no, I think chance did it, I think my wife would start to worry about my sanity. Even if I said, look, but darling, have you considered there could be billions of Brio train sets in the world, and we just happen to have the 1 in a billion train set that this has happened to tonight. I think she still wouldn't be persuaded, and I think she would be absolutely right not to be persuaded. Well, it's like that when we start looking at the natural world. Democritus was saying, look, this all could have happened just by chance. Socrates was saying, no way, that's just completely implausible to think that that could have come about by chance. And so it was very, very hard for anyone to be an atheist back in those days, because it was just ridiculous amounts of luck that people needed to try to explain the complexity that they saw around them. So, for example, here's John Ray, who's sometimes called the father of English botany. He wrote in his book, The Wisdom of God Manifest in the Works of Creation, "A wonder then it must needs be that there should be any man found so stupid and forsaken of reason as to persuade himself that this most beautiful and adorned world was or could be produced by the fortuitous concourse of atoms." And even before that, and long before Socrates, the psalmist in the Bible looked at his own body and said, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." You know, people have always looked at the natural world and thought, wow, that is amazing. That must have been created by an intelligent and powerful God. And I think the findings of modern science just put that inference on steroids, if you like. It's turbocharged that inference. We now know so much more than these people did centuries ago about the complexity of life and the complexity of that is all around us and within us. Well, how much more should we today believe in God than they did? Well, some of you will say, okay, fine, but science has given us something else as well. It's not just telling us about the complexity around us, but science has told us about evolution. And evolution explains all of this away. And prominent atheists will give you that answer. So, for example, Brian Cox on Universe for the BBC, when he points out we need an explanation for complexity, where does he go? Well, he goes, of course, to evolution. So this is what he says on the next slide. "No one knows exactly how life on Earth emerged, but what we do know is that at some point primitive cells living in the ocean began using the sun's energy to power life-giving chemical reactions. This process, known as photosynthesis, unleashed the sun's creative power and drove the evolution of complexity from primitive bacteria to plants and animals, and ultimately to you and me." He's fairly vague on the details, and he's clear that he doesn't know how life originated in the first place, but evolution is the answer for him. And the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins says something even more striking. "I could not imagine being an atheist at any point before 1859, when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist." Now, Richard Dawkins knows that there were atheists before Darwin, and these atheists, when they came to the complexity of the living world, just had to say this came about by pure chance. But he admits that that really is not intellectually fulfilling. He knows about the arguments of people like Democritus and says, but that's just not believable. And I think he's right, you know. It is simply not believable to think that all of this came about by chance. But Richard Dawkins says Darwin has made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Well, why is that? Well, because natural selection, Darwin's mechanism, is emphatically not a matter of luck. So it's really important to note here that Richard Dawkins' case for atheism as a leading atheist is all about eliminating luck as an explanation for how we got here. And he says Darwin can do that for us. Well, how does that work? What is it that makes natural selection succeed as a solution to the problem of improbability? The answer is that natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks down the problem of improbability, breaks it up into small pieces. Each of the pieces is slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. So what does he mean here? Well, what he's saying is, let's go back to this Brio illustration. Clearly, it was too much luck. It was implausible. It was too improbable to think that all 8 of those pieces could have fallen together in one go to make the circle. But what if my wife and I came down, Brio was scattered on the floor, and there were just two pieces that had fallen together, could we believe that that happened purely by chance? I think we probably could. I mean, it's unlikely, but I don't think we'd have to invoke a child out of bed or a thief to say, well, I believe that could have happened purely by natural processes. That could have happened by chance. So Darwin says, okay, great. Dawkins says, great. You can imagine that could happen purely by luck. It's not so much luck that it's incredible. Well, now imagine that there's a process that says a longer train track is a better train track. This is like natural selection. Longer train tracks, a better train track. So those two stay together. And let's imagine that there's also a process that is constantly throwing this Brio train set up in the air and letting it fall back down at random. And this is reproduction in life, in the analogy. Well, we keep throwing this Brio train set up and down, and then you could imagine that after a while, just by chance, another piece might join here. It's quite lucky it did, but not so lucky that we can't believe it happened by luck. And then we've got a slightly longer train track, and then natural selection says, keep that, that's good. And then we keep going, and then after a while, another one joins. Maybe it's 1,000 times, maybe 1,000,000 times more before that joins, but join it does. And so on and so forth. It gets longer and longer. And then eventually you get all of those 8 pieces together and you've got your train track. And so what is so great about this for Richard Dawkins is he thinks he's got a way of explaining away something that is so complex that we can't believe it could have happened by natural processes. And he said, actually, there is a mechanism that means we can believe that. This is Darwin's mechanism. Well, when you first hear that, you think, well, that's really neat. You know, that was pretty clever of Darwin to think of that. Surely this explains everything. But you have to remember, this is a really, really simple example. Okay, all I've done here is I've built up a circle. Sorry, I just broke it. But let's think about how much luck would be needed if I wanted to build up something more complex than a circle. For example, to really start to build a complex train set, tracks start having to cross over one another, don't they? But I can't just add this bridge straight onto here because the train track's not going to work if it joins like that. In order to get a bridge, first of all, I need this ramp to join. So that has to happen by chance. But once this ramp is joined by chance, I can't add any old piece of the train set to that. There's only one piece in the whole train set. Actually, we have 2 of these, actually. We do actually have 2 of these. We're very lucky. But there's only 2 pieces in our whole train set that could join here. You have to have that one. So you don't have to be a mathematician to know that the amount of luck you need for this bit to join instead of any other piece is a lot higher, because there's only 1 or 2 of these in the whole set. And then once you've got that, there's not any old piece that can join. You have to have the other ramp at the other end. And so to get a bridge like this, you need 3 things to happen, 3 exact things to happen in a row. The probability of that happening just by chance is much, 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 much lower than just having any old piece join. And remember, already we're needing quite a lot of luck to get pieces to join in the first place. And so in a biological system, this is like having to have 3 mutations in a row where you need 3 exact mutations all happening together before you get the improvement that you need. That needs a lot of luck. And so you can imagine, as soon as we're starting to build up something really complex, there's going to be lots of cases like that. You know, imagine that we were trying to build up a structure like ATP synthase. You're going to need lots of things that are exactly right to be able to have functionality. And you have to remember that in the Darwinian process, every step has to be small enough to happen by chance, but it also has to improve the functionality of the system that it's changing. So in our analogy, the Brio train set had to get longer each time. And in the biological equivalent, each change to the protein has to make the protein better at doing its job or another job. It has to improve it. it can't damage it. But then sometimes when you're building up something complex, you might have to go backwards. You know, if we've got a perfect circle made of brio, if we're going to make that into something more complex, we're going to have to break the circle and go backwards and introduce a junction. And the only way we can go backwards is by not having natural selection acting. We've got to go backwards by chance. That's called genetic drift, for anyone who's studied biology. That genetic drift happens purely by chance. And so we need chance again. So actually, the more you think about the Darwinian process, the more you realize still a lot of luck is needed to build up anything complex. So much, in fact, that it starts to become implausible. But also there's a bit of an elephant in the room, because when trying to explain this in my analogy, I said, what if there's a process that is throwing this brio up and down? That's what life does. You know, that's where life comes in the analogy. But if I was telling my wife, well, maybe this came about because something was throwing it up and down and there was a selective process selecting for a longer train set. Well, how did that happen? Well, presumably there'd have to be something like this in the room, a little robot that was continuously throwing them up and down and then selecting for the longer one. And to persuade my wife that that was the case, of course, the robot would have to be there. But if the robot was there, she would say, okay, I can see how maybe that could have come from the actions of that robot, but where did the robot come from? You know, explain that to me. That didn't come here just by chance, did it? That's in fact much more complicated than any piece of brio could possibly be. And that's the case that we have. You know, even if you granted to Richard Dawkins, okay, this Darwinian process can overcome the problem of improbability, it can produce new complex things. Grant him that point. It's a point that, to me, is still rather implausible. But grant him that point. He's still got the problem of, well, where did life come from in the first place? And he admits that he doesn't really have an answer to that. So on the next slide, we've got a quote from his book, The God Delusion. We really need Darwin's powerful crane to account for the diversity of life on Earth, and especially the powerful illusion of design. Let me just pause there. That's interesting phrasing, isn't it? The powerful illusion of design. He admits it looks designed. He admits life looks designed. But he's saying that must be an illusion. For him as an atheist, it has to be an illusion, because there can't be a designer, because the designer would have to be God. So it's an illusion for him. The origin of life, by contrast, he continues, lies outside the reach of that crane because natural selection cannot proceed without it. Darwin's mechanism doesn't work unless you have life already. You have to have replication happening. You have to have small changes happening. You have to have genetic information being passed down across generations. Otherwise, the mechanism doesn't work at all. But Dawkins doesn't have an explanation for where life comes from. You'll remember in the quote from Brian Cox, he said, nobody knows how life originated in the first place. And Dawkins agrees with that. And so what does he appeal to explain the origin of life? Well, he comes back to sheer luck. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck. And then he goes on to say that the origin of complex eukaryotic cells may also be due to sheer luck. He says it could have been an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step. And then he says the origin of consciousness also might be of the same order of improbability. So you ask Richard Dawkins, how do you explain the origin of life? Oh, it was luck. How do you explain the origin of the eukaryotic cell? Well, it was luck. How do you explain the origin of consciousness? Oh, that was luck as well. But we've been trying to get away from luck. You know, luck is the problem, isn't it? Before Darwin, it was impossible to be an atheist because you had to believe in so much luck. The great thing about Darwin is it means we don't have to believe in so much luck. But then we do need luck to explain the origin of life, eukaryotic cell, consciousness, and maybe one or two other things as well. So he's back where Democritus was, isn't he? He's appealing to exactly the same kind of process. But it's worse for Dawkins, because today nobody that I'm aware of believes that the universe is infinite. No one believes it's infinitely old. No one believes that it is infinitely large. On the next slide, got a diagram of that's trying to sort of describe the universe over time. It has a beginning and it has a finite size. So that doesn't give him the billions and billions, in fact the infinite number of opportunities that Democritus thought he had. It actually gives him a finite number of opportunities. So today, appealing to luck is even less plausible than it was in the times of Democritus, who could at least sort of posit that there might be an infinite universe. It's also worse for Dawkins today, because as I've been saying, and as is shown on the next slide, we now know so much more about the complexity of the living world. You know, we know that the simplest life forms contain structures like this. The simplest life forms have to be able to replicate DNA or some other hereditary material. That's what the one next to the motor is doing. And they need to be able to move around the energy to make that happen. And that's what ATP synthase does. ATP synthase is found throughout the whole of life. We have trillions of this powering our cells. It's found in simpler forms of life as well, and in bacteria. We don't know, that I'm aware of life forms that don't have something like this to process energy. So Dawkins is really having to say something like that, maybe not exactly like that, but something like that has to be able to come about just by chance. Democritus had no idea that life was that complicated. We now know that. And so for us, I just think it's so much harder to believe this all could have come about by pure luck. So you might say, well, why on the earth then would intelligent people like Richard Dawkins and Professor Brian Cox, why would they think that this is a good explanation? Well, I think the reason is actually baked into the way they ask the question. So if you look closely at what Brian Cox said in his documentary, when he said, everywhere you look on earth there is complexity, so you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge in the universe? No, he doesn't just say, how could such complexity emerge in the universe? He says, how could such complexity emerge completely naturally in the universe? And so what is he doing when he says completely naturally? Well, he's saying without God, without the supernatural. So he's not even open to an answer that could involve God. Baked into his question is an exclusion of one of the possible answers. So to my mind, the most obvious answer is that there is a God. There is someone who is intelligent enough and powerful enough to have planned, designed, and made these things. But someone like Brian Cox doesn't even let God get a foot in the door by asking the question in such a way that the only answers allowed are ones that just invoke natural causation. So it's the philosophical presuppositions that he's coming with that are excluding God. It's not the scientific evidence itself. The scientific evidence itself, I think, is actually pointing towards God, and so long as you haven't excluded him from the outset. So just to conclude, just summing up where I stand on this issue, complexity points to God today more powerfully than ever. We now know so much more about the complexity of life. The age-old argument from design has not been refuted by Darwin. People saying that Darwin makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, that their arguments don't really add up, because they're saying it gets them away from luck, but then they still are having to invoke huge amounts of luck in a framework that's less plausible than the ancient Greeks had. Recent scientific discoveries point to a powerful, intelligent, and awe-inspiring God. And I think if we just sort of think about this and let that sink in, it's quite a terrifying thought, isn't it, that there could be a God who is intelligent enough to encode things that makes our mind just boggle at the complexity of them, who could make things which are just so much more complex and so much more tiny than anything that we can make. You know, any God who can do that is a very terrifying prospect. And if we've never sort of given him credence before, if he's someone we've never really thought about before, then to start thinking about him is quite a life-changing thing and quite a scary thing in many ways. So as I close, I just want to point out something that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And I find this extremely compelling, and I think it fits in very well with what I've been saying in this talk. Jesus looked at the flowers growing around him in the field. He said, "Look, see how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that even Solomon, in all his splendor, he was not dressed like one of these." So Jesus is drawing a comparison between something in the natural world and something made by human beings, a bit like Socrates was when he compared a statue to a human being. Jesus is saying, look, this flower is a bit like the royal robes that Solomon would have worn when Israel had loads of money. Solomon was a king at a time when Israel had loads of money, loads of artists, and could make the most amazing clothes. And maybe there were sort of botanical motifs in the clothes of Solomon, I don't know. But Jesus says, we have to compare the two, and then when we do, the flowers win the competition for being the most artistic thing. And Jesus just assumes that as we make that comparison, it's just obvious to us that the flowers must have been made by God. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, what do you expect him to say next? What a terrifying God he must be. Well, that would be true, but he doesn't say that. He says, how much more will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? Jesus is telling us that this amazing God who made the world of nature around us and who made us ourselves, he is powerful, he is amazing, but also he cares for us. And the way he has made this world indicates to us his care. He cares for the flowers, he cares for us, and he'll clothe us and he'll feed us. And so Jesus is telling us that this God is not necessarily a God who is against us. He's a God who cares about us and who we can come to know and trust and have a relationship with. And so whilst we might be terrified by what science is telling us about God, Jesus tells us this is a God who you can come to know and love and trust. And I think that's the best thing that any of us can do in response to what the natural world is telling us. Thank you very much.